Lee Radziwill, Jacqueline Kennedy's younger sister, lived a life that many believed was glamorous on the outside but complicated and troubled behind the scenes. When she passed away in February 2019 in her Manhattan apartment, most people assumed she had died broke. Even her own family thought she had been selling off her jewelry just to pay her bills. But 5 weeks later, lawyers revealed a shocking truth. Lee had secretly hidden a fortune worth $50 million. The bigger surprise wasn't just the money, but who she left it to. In the months before her death, she quietly rewrote her will, and the person she chose to inherit everything left her family speechless. It was more than an inheritance. It was the final chapter in a family rivalry that had started decades earlier with her famous sister, Jackie Kennedy. Lee was born Caroline Lee Bouvier on March 3, 1933, at Doctors Hospital in Manhattan, a place known for catering to New York's richest families. Even in such a wealthy setting, her birth caused a stir. Her father, John "Blackjack" Bouvier, was a Wall Street broker who loved to show off, even though he often didn't have the money to back it up. He arrived at the hospital wearing a camel hair coat he couldn't really afford, passed out cheap cigars, and insisted that his daughter's birth be published in the New York Times. That little announcement cost $16 at the time, equal to about $350 today. He also mailed out 48 formal birth announcements on fancy Tiffany stationery, complete with a golden family crest. The crest, which he pretended came from French royalty, had actually been bought for $451 from a shop in Manhattan. By the time Lee was born, her older sister Jacqueline was already 4 years old and was considered the incomparable child of the family. Now there were 2 Bouvier daughters who, as people along Park Avenue whispered, would grow up to be known for both their beauty and their social status. But Lee's childhood was far from stable. Her father became notorious for his wild behavior. Between 1935 and 1939, private detectives recorded that he had at least 23 affairs. His lovers included showgirls, a Brooklyn heiress, and even a married yacht owner he met at the Belmont Stakes. He bragged about being able to drink almost a quart of scotch and still charm women by midnight. Lee was only 7 when she heard her mother crying after finding a pawn ticket for Blackjack's sapphire cufflinks. He had pawned them to pay for a secret trip to Havana with one of his mistresses. Surrounded by such chaos, Lee grew up in a world where money, charm, and scandal were always close by. Her nannies told stories about her father's behavior as if they were fairy tales. Those early years shaped her future. Later in life, Lee admitted that she was often drawn to men who reminded her of him. Wealthy men, men with titles, or men with reputations for reckless living. She once told Truman Capote, "Daddy taught me 2 things, champagne before noon, and never expect fidelity." By the time she was 17, Lee was already making headlines on her own. On Christmas Day in 1950, Life magazine published a full-page feature about her debut into society. The photo, taken by Milton H. Green, showed her in a stunning white satin gown inspired by Dior. The dress had cost $900, a small fortune at the time, and was decorated with over 400 pearls. Her mother was so proud that she ordered 2,000 copies of the photo to use as Christmas cards. Mailing them alone cost more than an average American family's rent for an entire month. The magazine received over 1,300 letters asking about her tiara, which had been borrowed from her eccentric aunt Edith Beale, who later became famous in the documentary Grey Gardens. That year, there were nearly 2,000 young debutantes in America, but behind the scenes, Life editors ranked Lee as #1 for her beauty and photogenic quality. The attention began to affect her relationship with Jackie. At one society event in Philadelphia, another girl was described as pretty, but no Lee Bouvier. Jackie once admitted to a friend that she felt the world had crowned her younger sister as Cinderella before she had even arrived at the ball. Even Lee's nickname was carefully chosen. It wasn't just a casual shortening of her name. Her mother insisted on Lee so that her maiden name, Bouvier, would appear in newspapers and society pages as often as possible. At Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, a finishing school for wealthy young women, Lee was trained to marry into European aristocracy. The school cost $1,400 a year, 3 times more than tuition at an Ivy League university. Lee excelled at subjects like the decorative arts of the French monarchy, but struggled with practical topics such as managing money. Her classmates remembered her practicing curtsies in front of mirrors, while others timed how long she could hold the perfect dip. The girls even kept scrapbooks of eligible bachelors. Lee's scrapbook included European aristocrats like the Duc de Brissac and the Earl of Dalhousie. By the time she graduated in 1951, she had mastered skills like setting a formal dining table for 18, identifying 42 different types of French cheese by smell, and memorizing the proper way to address every royal family in Europe. Her mother was thrilled. This was exactly the kind of preparation she had hoped for her daughters. But in reality, the Bouviers' wealth was an illusion. Their income came from old properties, firewood, and timber, and most of it had begun to crumble during the Great Depression. Records showed that Blackjack's brokerage firm lost over $200,000 between 1930 and 1940, equal to about $4 million today. He kept up appearances by borrowing from his wife's trust fund, staying at expensive hotels, and hiring private drivers. The family claimed French noble roots, but in truth, their ancestor was a cabinet maker in Philadelphia. Even the grand family crest was just copied from a French book. Despite the illusions, Lee's world sparkled. By age 20, she was ready to marry. On April 18, 1953, she wed Michael Temple Canfield at her stepfather Hugh Auchincloss's estate. The wedding was arranged quickly, just 8 weeks after their engagement, and 700 guests attended. The press called it a fairy tale romance, but Lee privately admitted that she married simply to escape her home life. Her father arrived drunk, and Jackie had to lead him through the gardens to prevent a public embarrassment. The ceremony was rushed, with no reception afterward. The couple left immediately for London. Michael Canfield came from a wealthy publishing family, but there were whispers that his real parentage was much more scandalous. Rumors claimed he was the secret son of Prince George, Duke of Kent, and an American woman named Alice Preston, who was glamorous but troubled by drug addiction. She died in 1946 after jumping from a hotel window, while Prince George had died in a plane crash in 1942. Gossip suggested that their child had been secretly adopted and renamed Michael Canfield. Even Michael's second wife recalled that the Duke of Windsor once stared at him during lunch and muttered, "I'm certain your husband is my brother's son." Lee's own family doubted the marriage. Her stepfather whispered before the ceremony, "He'll never be able to afford her." Her mother worried that Michael's $9,000 salary, equivalent to about $75,000 today, would never be enough to keep up with Lee's expensive tastes. Jackie even joked that her sister needed either a prince or a publisher with more shares. Lee proved them all correct almost immediately. The day after the wedding, she sorted through her gifts, keeping only those she wanted for New York and returning the rest. When her bridal bouquet wilted in the heat, she demanded a new one at 3 times the cost. For Lee, luxury wasn't a phase. It was her way of life. 6 months after the wedding, Lee and Michael moved to London. Michael found a modest job with Harper's, while Lee threw herself into the glamorous social scene. In just 1 year, she hosted more than 40 dinner parties, joined exclusive private clubs, and bought 3 expensive gowns in a single week, all charged to Michael's account at Harrods. She even imported dogs and an American refrigerator, paying more than £1,800 just in customs fees, which was already over 4 months of Michael's salary. To keep up with her lifestyle, Michael had to borrow money. Lee once confessed to Truman Capote that she always preferred men with titles over men with fortunes. By 1957, she was spending at least £8,000 a year on clothes alone, which was 6 times more than Michael earned at work. People whispered in his office that he spent his days editing books just so he could fund Lee's endless parties at night. Lee was only 26 when she walked into a London registry office in a powder blue dress, tangled in the remains of a marriage the Catholic Church still hadn't forgiven. Her name was written as Lee Bouvier, recently divorced but without an annulment. Standing next to her was Prince Stanislav Radziwill. On paper, their marriage wasn't fully legal, but that didn't stop the Kennedys from rushing to convince the Vatican to erase her past. It would take more than 3 years for the annulment to be granted, but none of that mattered in the moment. Traffic outside Caxton Hall came to a halt as flashing cameras captured her every move, More than 30,000 photographs were taken that day. By the time she stepped into her new home just down the street from Buckingham Palace, people were already calling her a princess. The newspapers had a field day with the story. They pointed out that Polish royal titles had not been legally recognized since 1921, but that didn't slow the attention or the spectacle. Her dress was created by Oleg Cassini's old assistant, and Lee smiled as though she belonged in a royal fairy tale. Yet behind the glamour, the truth was far more complicated. The prince wasn't exactly free when they began their relationship. He was still married to Grace Colin, a Swiss banking heiress, when he and Lee started their affair the year before. Grace found out the way many people in high society did, by reading about it in the gossip columns. She filed for divorce in November, and the headlines spread from Zurich to London. Grace was cast aside, but she didn't stay down for long. Within 2 years, she remarried and became the Countess of Dudley. Meanwhile, Lee was splashed across the covers of nearly every major magazine: Paris Match, Life, and Tatler. She wasn't just the new princess, she was a scandal, and the world couldn't look away. Just 4 months after the wedding, Lee gave birth to her son Anthony in Lausanne. The following year, her daughter Tina was born in New York. John F. Kennedy, who was then the president-elect, even sent a telegram, joking that her baby had been born into 2 republics and 1 extinct kingdom. But motherhood did not slow Lee down. By 1963, she had flown more than 120,000 miles, more than any other woman in America who wasn't working for an airline. She hired multilingual nannies to raise her children while she traveled constantly between London and New York. Her son Anthony would later go on to win a prestigious Peabody Award before tragically passing away from cancer at the age of 40. Her daughter Tina stayed out of the spotlight and ultimately inherited her mother's $50 million fortune when Lee passed away in 2019. To the public, Lee appeared to be the perfect mother, hosting grand birthday parties at Claridge's Hotel and dressing her children in expensive designer sailor suits. But inside the family, the staff had a different name for them. They called them the photo-op children. No matter how polished they looked, the real competition was never between Lee and her kids. It was always between Lee and her sister, Jackie. In 1962, that rivalry reached a new height. Jackie invited Lee to join her on a diplomatic tour of India and Pakistan. For Lee, it became a personal fashion runway. She transformed traditional Indian saris into glamorous evening outfits and managed to change her look 22 times in just 9 days. Photographers began calling her the White Maharani. In Lahore, the president of Pakistan even gave her a horse. Crowds cheered for her as though she were royalty, often louder than they did for the official political events. Even decades later, photographs from that trip sold at auction for nearly $50,000. While world tensions grew back home, Lee managed to turn a sisterly invitation into a global fashion triumph. But behind the glamorous facade, her marriage was crumbling. By the mid-1960s, her husband was frequently away, spending his time with models and movie stars, and the royal fairy tale began to fall apart. Lee eventually began her own quiet affairs. By 1963, she and her husband were maintaining 11 homes, not for comfort but simply to keep their schedules, and their lovers, separate. Money was always a problem. Though Lee had a trust fund, she spent far more than it provided. Jackie often stepped in to cover some of her bills, once joking that Lee's spending was as endless as the Radziwill family history. Yet no matter how far Lee traveled or how glamorous her life became, people still introduced her as Jackie's sister. Even her husband wasn't spared the comparison. During John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign, he traveled to 42 cities in just 20 days, trying to win over Polish-American voters, dragging the Radziwill name further into politics. By 1974, the marriage was over. Lee filed for divorce, citing her husband's misconduct. He was even photographed with a young French model, while Lee, dressed in Halston, tried to hold her head high. The fairy tale had ended. At 40 years old, she was stretched thin financially and, for the first time in many years, simply Lee again. Then came Truman Capote. In 1967, the writer set aside his own work to focus on her. He believed she could be a star, not just any star, but someone who could rival Jackie. Truman saw Lee's insecurities and her jealousy, and he thought he could turn them into fuel for success. He arranged acting lessons, screen tests, and even promised to rewrite Breakfast at Tiffany's with her in mind. Lee was 34, with no acting experience, but Truman thought her hunger for recognition would carry her through. Her first test came on stage in Chicago, performing The Philadelphia Story. Tickets sold out in just 2 days, and celebrities packed the theater. But the critics were merciless. One said she sounded as though she were reading an airline safety card. Another described the audience physically wincing during her performance. Truman left the theater early. The production lost more than $65,000, and any Broadway plans were quickly cancelled. Still, Truman didn't give up. He helped her land the lead role in a television remake of Laura. An incredible 38 million people watched the broadcast, but the reviews were even harsher. Critics called her the worst actress of the season, and the newspapers tore her apart. The show aired once, then vanished forever. That was when the prince stepped in. He warned Lee that if she embarrassed the family again, he might take their children. It wasn't an official threat, but it was enough. Within weeks, Lee quit another stage production and told reporters she was leaving acting behind. She never returned to it. Capote later claimed that the prince's warning had killed her dream, but in truth, Lee had already begun losing faith. During rehearsals, she kept a private notebook, writing words like forgettable and questions like, why bother if not adored? She asked friends whether polite applause meant she was invisible. After the disastrous reviews of her TV role, she locked herself in her hotel room for 2 days, replaying the broadcast again and again, circling the lines she thought she had delivered well. But the damage was done. That same year, Lee suffered an even more devastating betrayal. Her marriage was crumbling, and she had been romantically involved with Aristotle Onassis. For Lee, he represented more than wealth. He was a chance to step back into the spotlight and perhaps, at last, to outshine Jackie. Onassis was unimaginably rich. His yacht stretched over 300 feet, he owned private islands, and he lived on a scale few could imagine. Lee visited his island, stayed on his yacht, and even began using stationery with the name Lee B. Onassis. She believed she was stepping into a future beside him. But in the fall of 1963, everything changed. During a cruise where both sisters were present, Onassis gifted Jackie a diamond and ruby necklace worth $250,000. To Lee, he gave 2 charm bracelets worth about $250. When she tried to protest, he silenced her by saying, Jackie needs legends. The moment humiliated her deeply. Even years later, she would shake those charm bracelets angrily in front of friends, still hurt by the memory. The final blow came in October 1968. Out of nowhere, Onassis called Lee to tell her he was marrying Jackie, and the wedding was in just 3 days. Lee was not invited. The ceremony was small, only 45 guests, and lasted just 7 minutes, but the press turned it into a worldwide spectacle. Jackie was painted as a fairy tale widow remarrying into luxury, while Lee was left behind, betrayed and humiliated. That night, she called Truman Capote in tears. The conversation lasted more than an hour, with Lee repeatedly asking how her sister could have done this to her. Truman listened, but later turned her pain into material for his writing. Lee never forgave him. Jackie's marriage to Onassis cemented the divide between the sisters. Financially, Jackie became co-owner of a fleet of oil tankers. Lee, after her divorce, had only $50,000 to her name. Jackie got magazine covers, headlines, and the kind of wealth most people could never dream of. Lee drifted from one borrowed home to another, clinging to old memories. By 1976, Lee Radziwill was 42 years old and still trying to recover from her very public failures. Her acting career had ended in disaster, but now she was sitting in her Fifth Avenue apartment announcing something new. She had launched a business, Lee Radziwill Incorporated, an interior design company. Her very first project was a major one. The Americana hotel chain hired her to redesign 2 presidential suites, one in Florida and one in Mexico. The suites cost over $225 a night at the time, which would be the equivalent of about $1,200 today. Lee told the press she was handling everything herself, from concepts to installation, though she admitted her phone bill had already passed $2,000 just from fabric orders. The New York Times pointed out that she was using her own name, not her married title. She wanted to succeed on her own merits, not on borrowed status. Her real breakthrough, however, didn't come from hotels. It came when she allowed photographers into her own homes. When Elle Decor republished photos of her Paris apartment and New York duplex in 2009, readers were stunned. One room was completely covered in bold Chinese-style cotton. Another paired gold-framed mirrors with delicate watercolors. Her dining table was surrounded by French chairs once owned by a famous decorator. The photos fascinated people. Calls poured into her office, so many that her assistant told people they'd have to wait 6 months just for a simple color plan. For the first time, Lee was no longer seen as just a woman with good taste. She was being paid for it. Giorgio Armani noticed her work too. In 1983, he gave her the title of Director of Special Events. The role was intentionally vague. She chose guest lists for fashion shows, advised celebrities on what to wear, and helped plan events that blended fashion with society. A single Paris show could generate $5 million in media buzz, and Armani's staff joked that Lee did half the work simply by sitting in the front row. In 3 years, she organized 27 parties, each with exactly 140 guests, what she considered the perfect number for a hostess to greet without seeming bored. Her travel budget was over $100,000 a year, and Armani later admitted that she was the one who connected his brand with Hollywood stars and cultural icons. That kind of influence couldn't be bought, it had to be lived. Interior design gave Lee something she had never truly had before, a world where Jackie's fame did not overshadow her. She had grown up surrounded by luxury in Italy, England, and Greece, but people often mocked her for having style without purpose. Now, that same style was earning her money and recognition. By 1980, she was charging $300 an hour for her work. She even designed a full room installation at Lord & Taylor, something no unlicensed designer had ever done before. Her taste leaned toward quiet, understated luxury, and for once, it was finally hers. Lee Radziwill's life was full of glamour, heartbreak, reinvention, and quiet battles that few people truly understood. Behind her image as Jackie Kennedy's younger sister, she lived through a series of highs and lows that defined her journey. By the mid-1970s, her personal life had already begun to unravel. In 1974, the British press reported that Lee was divorcing Prince Stanislav Radziwill after 15 years of marriage. There were rumors of affairs on both sides, but when the divorce was finalized, Lee accepted a modest settlement compared to the vast fortune many assumed she had access to. She kept the estate but received only about £120,000, roughly $2 million today, and gave up any rights to family land in Poland, which was already under communist control. 2 years later, the prince died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving their children Anthony and Christina devastated. Even as she was launching interior design projects and building a new career, Lee often struggled with money. At one point, she pawned a Cartier cigarette case just to repair her estate's roof.